In this video, I'm going to show you how to crop using the Magic Wand tool. Before we can crop anything, we need to make sure that the objects that we've added in are rasterized so that we can make edits. So in the Layers palette, when I look in, we can see that these are smart objects and they have the smart object icon. That usually happens when we add an object to a file. All I need to do is come to the layer, right click on it, and then come down to rasterize layer. So I'm going to do that to both of my things. Now they both can be edited because they are raster objects. I'm going to focus on the front deer and I'm going to remove the background of this one. And just so we can make it very easy for us to see what we're editing, what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a new layer. I'm going to put it above my background, but below my two objects. And I'm going to use the paint bucket tool with an obnoxious color. And so now we can see, once I remove the areas that I want, we're going to be able to see that violet, and we can see how well our cropping works. So the tool that we're going to use is the Magic Wand tool. It is connected to the quick selection tool. And if I click and drag, you can see that I get my different options, and they're all keyed to the hotkey of W. So I'm going to select the Magic Wand tool. And what the Magic Wand tool does is it allows me to click and it creates a selection of whatever's there. Since we're on layer 1, which we can see is everything, it's just a big old block of purple, it selected everything. I'm going to deselect that by coming up to select and deselect. And I'm going to come back to my sheep layer. And when I try to make a selection, notice that it made a selection along on what it thought it could grab. I can play around with the tolerance up in the properties bar. There is a variety of things that you can kind of play around with. So when I look up here, you can see that right now I have on replace selections. So every time I click, it's going to try to create a new selection. Or I could have it set to add selections. So every time I click, it's going to add on a little bit more. Or I could change it to remove selections. So every time I click into a selection that I've made, it'll remove something. This will work the same if I use Shift to keep on adding, or I use Option to subtract. But it's getting really crazy. So I'm going to deselect for a second. And we'll make a selection right here. The next thing that you should really look at is the tolerance. Right now, I have a tolerance of 16, which means that the different colored pixels or lights and darks is where it's going to define it. And it has a tolerance of 16. I could raise that to, we'll say 60. And I'll try to retake that selection. You can see, since it has a bigger tolerance, it selects more. But it's accidentally selecting a bunch into my deer. That's a ram. Into my ram. So you don't want to have your tolerance too high or too low. Play around with it, see what works for you to get the closest to your objects. Another thing that you want to play around with is that you can play around with this button here. The contiguous button is an interesting one. Right now it's checked off, which means like water flowing until it hits something hard, this is only going to make selections between things that are not hitting a barrier. And once it hits that barrier, it's going to stop. If I take that off though, when I make my selection, it's going to try to grab every pixel, regardless of where that is. You can see even it's making some selections in the deer and on the other side over here. That's a ram, by the way. So that can be very helpful if I want to remove all of a similar kind of color, but it can be very hard to control. So I'm going to turn that back on. I'm going to deselect, and I'm going to start removing some things. So I'm selecting around and I'm pressing delete. This can grab very large sections at a time, but if I'm not careful, you can see how it accidentally grabs selections of my horns. So I'm going to have to undo that. And then maybe I'll change the tolerance to, I don't know, maybe 15. So that when I select this, not going to accidentally grab my horn. But you can see how messy this is. It's leaving some, it's keeping some, it's making it hard to grab little tiny amounts. So this isn't the best kind of way to use this tool. It's good for certain things, but definitely hard to crop out, especially if something has a very fancy and difficult background, and backgrounds that have lights and darks that we can also see lights and darks in that object, or whatever it is that we're trying to crop out. So I wouldn't use this for this kind of a subject. I'd use a lasso tool, the eraser tool, or the pen tool to create selections to accurately erase things. Where it's great is something like this guy, where it's a very clean thing and it's very obvious to tell where the background is and where the object is. So you can see, if I'm on the right layer, that is, when I switch over to the layer of the skull and I click on the white, it grabbed everything that's white. And then I'll just delete and then deselect, and that was really smooth and really easy. Unfortunately, it's left a little bit of a white edge, and I don't think I like that at all. So what I'm going to do is, before I delete it, I'm going to modify the edge. And I can modify the edge by coming up to Select and then come to Modify. I think I want to make my selection a little bit bigger, so I'm going to expand it. That way it comes in more onto my skull. Let's expand it by, we'll say 5 pixels. And we'll see how that works. That kind of cut in a lot. So I can undo that, or I can come to Modify and I can contract. And then maybe this time we'll contract it by something smaller, like 2. So that looks a little bit better. I can even make it a little bit smoother by coming to Select, Modify, and I can either smooth or I can feather. And I think I like feathering. And I'm going to feather by like 2 pixels. So it's a nice soft edge, so it like disappears just a little. So now when I delete and deselect, you can see there's no white left, and it's a little bit fuzzy so that my edge doesn't look so sharply cut. But that looks really good. Super easy. So we can see, I'm going to select this, I'm going to modify it, and I liked it how it looked with an expand of 3 and a feathering of 2. Delete, deselect. So that is beautiful and easy, but only beautiful and easy if it has a clean, simple background. If I have a very complex background, it doesn't do a good job at all. But it does make selections pretty quickly. So that was the Magic Wand tool.